I'd like to welcome my niece Ashley, who's filming for me today, my sister Ruby, my mother Beth, and my sister Lori for attending my speech. The topic of my speech is women in the military. The topic of women in the military seems to be the epitome of the age-old plight of women's rights and their quest for equality. Does adjustment of training criteria to accommodate the inclusion of women negate the term equality? At what point does their agenda become life-threatening and damaging to a nation's military preparedness? Information I found on this subject has been quite eye-opening. I found several examples of criteria having been adjusted to accommodate the physical ability of women. Brian Mitchell, in his book, Weak Link, The Feminization of the American Military, shared that at West Point, the Enduro Run, which is a 2.5-mile run in full combat gear, was terminated as being part of training because of complaints from feminists. In 1980, women were allowed to participate in this run, but the leaders had decided not to evaluate them in their performance. Because of the discontent this generated, the following year, men and women were both evaluated equally. As a result, men performed better than the women did, and proportionally won more awards than the women, resulting in the complaints by the feminists and the elimination of the run from training. Mitchell also pointed out that in the Marines, the women were tested on how far they could throw. Barely half of them could throw far enough to not blow themselves up if what they were throwing was a grenade. This is a disheartening example of the danger created by the physical limitations of women. Robert H. Knight wrote an article for the Heritage Foundation about testimony given before the United States District Court in Roanoke, Virginia, in regard to the Virginia Military Institute's men-only admissions policy. Colonel Patrick Toffler, the director of West Point's Office of Institutional Research, testified that his research determined 120 physical differences between men and women, including psychological differences that prompted the Academy to make exercises easier due to the adverse impact on women. He testified the Recondo Endurance Week, an obstacle course event that requires upper body strength and running with heavy weapons, was eliminated because women couldn't do it. According to Knight, not only are men not receiving the physical training necessary to challenge their physical strength and abilities to prepare them for battle, but the Committee on Women's issue called for the immediate dismissal of senior officers who questioned the role of women in the military. In his book, Women in the Military, Flirting with Disaster, Brian Mitchell told about a test the Navy performed that evaluated the performance of women before and after training on a ship that had been hit. This chart indicates the results of that evaluation. Men had a failure rate, they're represented in the blue, of 8 tasks. Men had a failure rate of 0% in 6 of the 8 tasks, and a failure rate after training of only 9% on 2 of those tasks. Women, however, had a failure rate after training that exceeded 55% on 6 of the 8 tasks, and the final 2 tasks, they had a failure rate of 99%. With the adjustment of training, what effect does it have not only on the morale of the men in combat, but on their preparedness for combat? On October 7th, Michelle Norris of NPR reported stories of 3 women who were deployed for 1 year in Iraq and in the Middle East. Norris reported that these women stressed their desire to be treated equally, and that they believed that their training had been the same as the experiences, and their experiences and worries the same as their fellow soldiers. According to my research, I'm not totally convinced that they were equally trained because of Arizona Republican Christopher Ginn's response in writing inquiries to Senator John McCain. Mr. Ginn, the Undersecretary of Defense for Manpower, stated, and I quote, "If current combat exclusion laws were repealed, the Department of Defense would be obligated to allow women to enter any career area for which they qualify. This would seem fair on the surface, but standards have been lowered or eliminated to accommodate women at the nation's service academies and in the armed services generally. So the concept of qualified may have to become elastic to meet social pressures rather than the needs of military preparedness. In Robert H. Knight's article, Women in Combat, Why Rush to Judgment, he explains that this response was to Senator McCain's inquiry in regard to the Schroeder Amendment that would leave it up to the military to determine if women should be included in combat roles. It appears from this evidence that women can be equal in combat as long as the physical criteria is adjusted to allow them to compete. Lowering the standards for men to accommodate the ability of women has created malice among the ranks. You have to ask yourself if demanding equal opportunity where the strongest of women are only as strong as the weakest of men should be grounds for dismissal when her ability to meet the basic criteria is pointed out. If the results of the Navy's performance tests are accurate, would that mean then that the fighting men are being put in harm's way for the sake of the feminist agenda? Feminist groups are pressuring the government to include women in combat positions regardless of the complications that arise from the fact that women are not physically able to perform as well as men in these positions. While there are women who have been successful in their military career, there are many that are physically unable to pass muster. Has it become a game of political correctness, and is the effectiveness of a nation's defense being sacrificed? Thank you for listening.